Ever had to confront someone older than you and stand your ground?
I will not pretend I didn't feel it burn when my aunt smiled like she was paying me a compliment and said, in that patient tone she saves for toddlers and people she thinks are beneath her, that my cousin would always be ahead of me in life. Because even though I know how to keep my face steady and my voice calm, the words landed the way a cheap shot lands, fast and small and mean, and the table went oddly quiet in that family way where nobody wants to be the one who tells an adult to stop acting like a middle school bully, so I swallowed, nodded, and asked who wanted coffee with dessert, because apparently I am the kind of woman who keeps the plates moving even when someone is trying to stack them on my head. If you've ever sat through a family meal where one person thinks they are the narrator of your life, you know how it goes, because it is never about that one comment. It is about the years of them choosing a version of you that makes them feel large. And it is about the way the room tilts toward their opinion because they say it often, and they say it confidently, and people confuse volume with truth. So while I carried the carrot cake to the counter and pretended to study the knife, I ran through the old inventory I keep in my head, the job I did not get because she told a relative I was flaky, the holiday invite I was left off because she told someone I was sensitive, the stories she retold about my college mess-ups, but somehow never remembered the degree that came after, and I felt the familiar mix of anger and exhaustion that tastes like you are chewing on an old battery. I told myself to stay steady, because I know how this house works, and I know that if I snap I become the problem, not the insult, not the pattern, not the person who just announced a ranking of human worth over ham and green beans. So I asked who wanted decaf and who wanted the real thing, and I cut generous slices like a good girl who knows how to make a table run on time. But inside I was laying out tiny cards the way you do when you plan a trip, what she cares about most, how she maintains her image, what she never wants discussed, and I realized I was done being the quiet one who takes the hit and keeps clearing plates, because something about that line, your cousin will always be ahead, flipped a switch I didn't know I had. And I decided to use the only power I ever get in this family, which is that people will listen when I keep my voice low and my facts organized. When I set the first piece of cake in front of my aunt, I put down the extra fork she always requests, because she likes to say she is sharing to keep it light, and I said, lightly, that I had talked to our church coordinator the week before and heard they were still short a sponsor for the summer camp fee pool, which matters because the church kids come from families with uneven budgets, and that fund fills the gap. And I said how generous it was that my aunt had offered at Christmas to cover one full scholarship this year, because I remember her clinking a glass and making a little speech about giving back and setting an example, and it would be so helpful if she could confirm the amount so the coordinator could mark it as secured. And the way her smile pause told me she had not expected anyone to remember that performance from last winter. She laughed in that thin way that asks for rescue and glanced at my cousin like maybe he would change the subject, and he tried, he really did. Because he started telling a story about a client who bought a house at the top of the market and how it all worked out because he is a genius. But the table had already turned toward my aunt, and my mother, who is a straight arrow when money for kids is on the line, said that it would be wonderful to finally lock that commitment, and my brother's wife asked if there was a timeline, and I kept refilling cups like the world's calmest event planner while my aunt explained that she was, of course, absolutely planning to handle it. She just needed the paperwork, the details, the tax letter. Anything that makes a promise feel less like a promise and more like a to-do list that can be lost. I said I had already texted the coordinator and could forward everything right now, and I did not look at her when I said it, because eye contact would have turned it into a fight, and I wanted something cleaner than that. I wanted a quiet corner of accountability she could not wriggle out of without showing everyone at the table how much of her persona is air, so I sent the link and said the amount again, 1 camp slot, 1 kid, 1 summer, and the date by which the fund needed to be in place. And my aunt said it would be no problem and asked for the salt as if we were all done here, but I saw my cousin shifting in his chair because he understands money timing, and he knows his mother's stories about doing for others often end before the bill arrives. Maybe you think that is small, that it is petty to pin someone to their own toast, but let me tell you what felt different in that moment, because for the first time I did not try to win the argument about my worth. I did not start listing my achievements like I was applying for a job at my own table. I did not make a speech about respect or ask her to be kinder. I simply reminded the room of something she had said when she wanted applause and made sure the applause came with a receipt, and that little shift felt like oxygen after a long hallway with no windows, and I knew right then that I was not going to stop at one promise, because people who build their crown out of other people's backs need a mirror, not a debate. I cleaned plates, I laughed at the right parts, I kept the machine moving, and when they packed up to go and my aunt kissed my cheek like nothing had happened, she whispered that I should not take her words so seriously, that it was just family talk, that I was making it weird by freezing up, and I smiled and told her I loved how confident she was about my cousin's future because confidence is contagious, and then I handed her a small envelope addressed to the coordinator with the church office, stamped in the corner, because I had picked it up on purpose last week when I dropped off old clothes, and the only thing inside was a printed copy of her own Christmas speech with the line about stepping up for one kid highlighted, which meant she could walk out with dessert in her stomach and a decision in her purse, and she knew that if she did not send it in, silence would not keep it quiet this time. On my way home, I did not replay her sentence the way I usually do. I replayed the part where my cousin watched his mother blink. And I thought about what it means when the person who raised you on status starts to slip in front of the audience she worked so hard to control, and I decided that I was going to do something I should have done years ago, which is stop trying to change her and start changing the stage she performs on, and I had no idea then that within a few days a text would arrive late at night that made me laugh out loud in my kitchen, but before that, I had one more move to make, a small one, neat and simple, the kind you tie like a bow and leave on a doorstep, because if my aunt wanted a story about who would always be ahead, I was going to give her one, and it would start with a private message she would wish she had never sent. There is a special kind of fatigue that sets in when you realize the same scene has been playing on a loop for years, and you have been standing in the exact same spot every time, because when I looked back after Easter and let myself replay the hits, I could see the little edits my aunt made to my life story whenever there was a crowd to laugh or nod, like the graduation party where she told my grandfather I only finished because the program was easy and modern, as if work only counts if it looks old and hard, or the time my mother's book club asked me to speak about changing careers, and my aunt interrupted to explain that I change things because I get bored, which sounds harmless until you hear the way people respond when someone positions you as flaky while smiling. And of course there was the wedding shower where she complimented my dress and then whispered that when I finally settled down and had a husband I would stop chasing distractions, which I guess was her way of saying my life needed a chaperone, ideally male and tall and preferably named after a president. I am not one of those people who write lists of wrongs so I can rage into a mirror. I am the kind of person who files memory like a tax folder and then waits for the audit, so as soon as I felt the sting from Easter fade into that clear place where I think, well, I opened the drawers and took out the parts that mattered, not the cheap remarks or the little digs, but the parts where she moved something real, like the internship I lost because she told a cousin's wife I would be a drama magnet, and the family scholarship my sister received when I applied the year before but somehow there wasn't room, and the church committee bio she edited to shrink my work while inflating her own to something like a full-time position that never existed. And I realized her power was not that she was clever, her power was that we all let her keep the microphone. Here is what my aunt cares about more than anything, and I say this with the full confidence of someone who has watched her for decades. She cares about being seen as generous, as connected, as the person who makes things happen while gently rolling her eyes at people who, like me, supposedly talk too much about fairness. So if you want to take the air out of a balloon like that, you do not pop it. You show the knot to the room and ask who tied it. Which is why after I set that scholarship envelope in her bag, I started doing the boring work that makes a mess stick, the screenshots, the emails, the copies of newsletters where she announced her leadership on projects that moved forward without her touching a single spreadsheet. And I talked to the church coordinator who, bless her patient heart, said that my aunt had promised a pledge last year as well, and then gone silent with an elaborate story about funds being held up by a bank error that could never be verified, and she told me this. Like she was embarrassed to even say it out loud because good people will bend themselves into knots rather than call someone a liar. I was not going to march into my aunt's house with proof and a speech, because that would make the story about me, which is what she wants. So instead I did something practical and, to be honest, a little wicked in its neatness. I set up a simple family update email where I wrote, in my nicest event planner voice, that the church camp scholarship was nearly covered thanks to last year's generosity from a few relatives who chipped in together, and that this year we had a new goal to fund at least one slot, and I included a link to a tidy public tracker that showed only first names and amounts with a little note next to my aunt's line that said, "Pledge confirmed at Christmas, receipt pending." And I added at the bottom that once the fund was closed, I would ask the coordinator to send the thank you note to everyone listed so our records matched theirs, because I wanted the circle closed in a way that did not require me to raise my voice. You would think this would blow back on me, but here is what actually happened. 3 relatives replied within an hour with small amounts and warm messages. My mother responded with a longer note about community and follow-through. My cousin stayed quiet. And my aunt replied to me privately with a long explanation that sounded like a press release about being busy with taxes and an unexpected dentist bill, and also an ongoing situation with her cable provider that had, in her words, complicated online banking, which is exactly the kind of nonsense she uses when she needs time, and I wrote back something sweet about understanding and included the link again so she could handle it whenever she was ready, because the point was not to shame her. The point was to build a room where her performance could not run without the lights on. While the email did its slow work, I went back through group chat history and found a series of messages from last fall where my aunt had, in front of a younger cousin who looks up to her, laughed about how people confuse pledges with payments and how organizations will list you as a donor if you say the right words at the right time, which landed in my chest like a clean piece of evidence that did not need commentary. And, because I am done asking the room to trust my feelings, I forwarded that slice to my own email and kept it safe, alongside a PDF of her bragging LinkedIn update claiming she had co-chaired a school fundraiser that the actual chair ran while my aunt took pictures and posted captions. The thing about patterns is that they hold until something heavier drops onto them, and late one evening while I was half watching a detective show and half cleaning up my kitchen, my phone lit up with a message from a number I did not recognize right away because it was saved under a nickname from years ago, and when I opened it I saw a screenshot from my aunt to a friend where she wrote, in her breezy voice, that she had no intention of paying that camp thing because she had already gotten the social credit and I was obsessed with proving a point, and she asked for advice on how to stall without looking like a villain, which would have been funny if it had not been the purest version of her I had ever seen in writing. And while I stood there reading it twice to make sure I was not imagining the gift I had just received, a second message came through from the same sender, this time with the words, "Thought you should see what she said after Easter," and I realized the person who forwarded it was not a stranger at all but an old neighbor who had been burned by my aunt in a parent committee years back and was finally ready to push the domino with me. I did not respond right away, because this was bigger than a gotcha. This was the key to a door I had been pushing on with my shoulder for years. And if I used it clumsily, it would become just another family fight with plates clattering and someone crying in the bathroom. So I put my phone down, I let the kettle boil, I sat with the feeling of the room shifting in my favor, and then, very calmly, I scheduled one small message to go out the next morning that would look polite to anyone skimming, but would land like a hammer exactly where it needed to. And as I hit schedule, I thought about the way my aunt smiled when she said my cousin would always be ahead, and I knew that in a few days I would not have to argue with that smile ever again, because I had the text that would light the match. When people think about revenge, they picture fireworks and speeches and some grand reveal that looks good on a television show. But the truth is that the most effective kind is quiet and boring and layered with so many small reasonable actions that by the time the person who caused the harm realizes what happened, there is nothing to swing at, because there is no fight. There is only accountability that has finally caught up with them, and that was the lane I chose, not because I am saintly or above it, but because I wanted something that would hold even if I never said another word about it. So I sat at my kitchen table with a notebook that still had grocery lists in the back, and I wrote 3 lines. what she says publicly, what she actually does, and who believes her. And then, like a puzzle that someone else already started for me, the picture filled itself in. The first piece was simple and almost petty in its neatness, because the family update email that listed first names and a receipt pending note next to my aunt's pledge had already started to do its slow, steady work, which meant that if I added one more small, polite push, the structure would hold on its own. So I wrote to the church coordinator and asked whether the camp committee planned to publish a general thank you in the weekly bulletin, and when she said yes, absolutely, they always thanked donors at the end of spring. I asked if she would mind including a line thanking confirmed donors by first name while acknowledging outstanding pledges as awaiting receipt, since transparency helps close out funds before deadlines. And I framed it like a process suggestion, and then very gently added that I would be happy to draft the exact sentence if that would save her time, which it did, and by dinner time a polite, clean line existed in a document that would read like nothing but good housekeeping to anyone who wasn't trying to live off applause they had not paid for. The second piece was about breaking the magic trick she uses around introductions and titles, because my aunt has survived for years by sliding into the space between what a role sounds like and what it actually requires, which is how she became a co-chair of things she photographed and a mentor to people she cornered with advice. So I called the actual chair of last year's school fundraiser, who thankfully likes me because I showed up to hand out name tags and clean up without posting about it, and I asked a straightforward question about how we could help the next committee avoid burnout. And in that normal conversation, I learned that my aunt had promised to secure 2 corporate matches that never arrived, and then blamed the companies for changing policies, and the chair, who is kind to a fault, said she did not want to make a fuss because she hates drama. So I did what I always do. I made it not about drama and instead about process, and I offered to write a simple checklist for the next team that would include the instruction to confirm matches in writing before any acknowledgement was printed, along with a gentle note that public credit should only be assigned to verified tasks, which sounds dry and dull, and that is exactly why it works. The third piece was the seed of doubt that had to be planted in soil my aunt herself had prepared, because she has spent a lifetime teaching people to quote her, so I did not need to invent anything. I just needed to hold up her words at the right angle and let them cast their own shadow, which is why I returned to that forwarded screenshot from the neighbor where my aunt had bragged about getting social credit for a pledge she never intended to pay. And I sat on it for a day while I considered all the loud, satisfying things I could do with it, and then I reminded myself of my rule: no grand speeches, only small lights in rooms that have been dark too long. So I took that text and I copied the exact language of her little joke. The part about people confusing pledges with payments and how easy it is to stall if you speak the right way, and I repurposed it as a hypothetical scenario in a short piece I wrote for the Church Stewardship Committee's spring workshop, which I was invited to help with because I am the reliable one, and I printed it on a handout titled Common Pitfalls That Organizers Face, with no names and no dates and nothing that would make it personal. And I watched a few people nod when the facilitator read it out loud and said we should always separate applause from actual receipts for the health of the community. None of this required me to confront my aunt face to face, which matters because when you live in a family like mine, the person who demands accountability is always labeled the problem, and I was done auditioning for that part. So instead, I kept everything so reasonable and so public in the blandest way that the only way to argue with me would have been to argue against transparency, and even my aunt knows better than to do that out loud, which is why, when the bulletin proof went out for review to the usual list of volunteers and donors, I did not say a word. I simply looked at the line that thanked confirmed gifts by first name and listed outstanding pledges as awaiting receipt, including the one that everyone heard her promise at Christmas. And I let the document speak for itself, because it was not my accusation, it was our process. You might ask where the explosion is, where the part comes that makes people stand up and cheer, and I will tell you that it is not one moment, it is the chain of them, small and relentless. Because the bulletin proof triggered a very polite email from the coordinator to my aunt asking whether she preferred to be listed under confirmed or awaiting. And that email was copied to 3 people who matter to her image more than she cares about telling the truth: my mother, my grandfather, and the chair of the school fundraiser, who now had a checklist that would make it difficult for my aunt to glide on titles next year. And when my aunt replied with a flustered paragraph about timing issues and a bank glitch and how embarrassing it was that this was even being asked so publicly, the coordinator, bless her backbone, wrote back that she completely understood and would move the name to confirmed as soon as a receipt arrived, which is the kind of sentence that looks like a hug until you sit with it and realize it is a boundary. I did not celebrate, not outwardly at least, because the point was never to humiliate her. The point was to take away the stage she built on other people's backs and make her stand on the ground with the rest of us. So I let the day pass, and I kept my phone on Do Not Disturb while I worked, and only after dinner did I see that my cousin had finally texted me a single line asking whether I had heard anything about a weird church email, which made me smile because it meant the message had landed in the one place my aunt did not want it to, her own house, and I wrote back that I had no idea what he was talking about and that he should probably check with his mother, which I meant literally, but it also meant something else. Because earlier that afternoon I had set one last, tiny thing in motion, a scheduled family group note that would go out the next morning asking for any last-minute camp contributions and, in the friendliest tone, thanking everyone for closing their pledges by the end of the week so the bulletin could list accurate names, a message that would be harmless to any honest person and a live wire to someone who had built her identity on getting credit without paying. And as I put my phone face down, I knew that when that message went out, she would either make the payment and watch her special glow dim to something ordinary, or she would stall and watch the glow turn into a spotlight she could not control, and either way, the next move would be mine. There is a moment, and you can feel it like a click behind your ribs, when a person who has been skating on charm realizes the ice is not magic, it is just frozen water that cracks if you keep tapping it. And the morning the family note went out about closing pledges for the camp fund, followed an hour later by the church bulletin proof with the tidy line listing confirmed gifts and outstanding pledges awaiting receipt. I watched that click happen in real time without raising my voice or changing my face, because all I did was pour coffee, answer 2 ordinary emails, and let a structure I had built out of simple, decent expectations do the heavy lifting that my speeches never accomplished. And by the time I checked my phone at lunch, there were 3 messages that told me the air had shifted in the exact rooms I wanted it to shift. My mother, who never wastes words when money for kids is involved, sent a short message saying she had added a small amount to the fund so the timeline would be safe for the bulletin, and that she hoped everyone could lock theirs by the end of the week, because it reflects on the family when we overpromise and underdeliver. Which is her version of a siren without flashing lights. My grandfather forwarded the bulletin proof to a thread I did not realize he even knew how to use and typed a sentence about being proud of the family for stepping up, which he only does when he wants the older cousins to read between the lines. And then there was my cousin with the single question mark about the weird church email, which told me 2 things at once. That my aunt was scrambling and that she had not told him the truth about the Christmas toast that came with a price tag. I did not answer any of them right away, because the point was not to steer the conversation minute by minute. The point was to make a new gravity that pulled without my hands, so I went back to what I had planned for that day, which was asking the stewardship committee chair whether the spring workshop could include one tiny visual that might help close the last of the pledges before the deadline. A simple poster in the lobby with first names only under a heading that said "Thank you for making camp happen" and a second column that said "Pledges awaiting receipt," which is the kind of thing you see in schools and community theaters everywhere, and think nothing of it all because it looks like housekeeping. And when the chair said yes and asked if I would mind printing it because she had a dentist appointment, I said of course, because sometimes revenge looks like picking up foam board and a stapler. By mid-afternoon, the coordinator had quietly moved ahead with the bulletin layout and copied the usual review group, which now included my aunt because she had insisted years ago that her experience with public relations made her an essential set of eyes on any communication leaving the church office. And a few minutes later, she replied with what she probably thought was a smooth paragraph about how public acknowledgement can be sensitive for people navigating complicated finances, and maybe we Should simplify the donor line to read thank you to all who contributed without specifics, which would have made sense if anyone else had asked for it, and the coordinator, who has developed a spine the length of a highway after years of dealing with late payments and loud opinions, responded that she appreciated the concern, that the line was consistent with the committee's transparency practice, and that the list would move names to confirmed as soon as receipts came in, which is the kind of kindness that doubles as a door closing. What I did next was the smallest move of the entire plan and the one that felt like a string pulled on a sweater that had been itchy for years, because I texted my cousin, not with a lecture or a link or a screenshot, just with a practical question framed like help, since he loves the role of fixer. And I asked whether he knew if his mom had gotten the tax letter she needed from the coordinator for her pledge, because the office was trying to lock the bulletin, and sometimes those letters get stuck in spam, and I watched 3 dots blink and then disappear, which is how I knew the conversation had turned in his kitchen from a story about a bank glitch to a quiet, heavy silence where a son realizes his mother has been trading on a reputation that requires other people to pretend not to see, and I did not follow up. I just let the dots go dark. The poster idea took on a life of its own because that is what happens when you hand decent people an easy way to be decent, so by early evening the coordinator had printed it, taped it to a board in the lobby, and propped a small envelope next to it labeled camp receipts, and she sent one last email to the review group in the same warm tone she always uses, thanking early donors by first name and reminding anyone with an outstanding pledge that moving to confirmed before Sunday meant the bulletin could be accurate, and my phone stayed quiet in a way that felt loud, like the quiet after you set a timer and walk away, because I knew the clock was ticking in a house where attention is oxygen and the oxygen was thinning. I am not innocent in this, and I am not trying to be, because while all of that was humming along I set one more thing in motion that looked like nothing to anyone who does not live inside my family's particular gravity. A small update to the family email thread where I wrote, in my event planner voice, that I had spoken to the school fundraiser chair about creating a standing checklist for future volunteers so nobody burned out and so credit and tasks stayed aligned. And I attached a draft with a line that said public acknowledgments should only be assigned to completed work and confirmed donations, which is reasonable to a fault and also a quiet knife for anyone who has been collecting titles like free samples. And I saw that my aunt opened the file because the email system I use shows read receipts, but she did not reply, and neither did my cousin, and neither did the 2 relatives who have been her best audience for years. Shifts like this never explode. They sag and then snap, and the snap came that night in a meeting my aunt could not skip, the stewardship workshop where the facilitator read the anonymous scenarios I had written to help volunteers spot common pitfalls. And when she got to the one about people confusing pledges with payments and organizations giving public credit before receipts arrive, I watched 2 heads tilt toward my aunt, not accusatory, just curious, and my aunt laughed a little too hard, and told a story about corporate bureaucracy that sounded suspiciously like every excuse she has ever used, and the facilitator nodded and said that was exactly why they now asked for receipts before printing the thanks, and the room moved on. But my aunt did not, and I know because I saw her step into the hallway afterward and make a call with that tight smile that means she is angry and trying not to show it. You want the bang, the moment the audience can stand up and say yes finally, and here it was, not with confetti, but with a name printed under a waiting receipt on a church board that anyone could see and a bulletin proof that would not change its language for a temper, and a son who had just discovered that his mother's crown was made of foil. And while I washed my face and turned off lights, my phone lit up on the counter with a notification that popped through even on Do Not Disturb, a message from my cousin that I did not open right away because I wanted to sleep before I saw what admission looked like in his voice, and I stood there looking at the screen until it went dark again and thought, this is the part where the story finally leaves her mouth and enters mine. When my phone lit up just after midnight with my cousin's name and the preview line asking me to please call because his mother was upset and would not tell anyone why, I let it ring once and then watched it stop because I wanted to feel the shape of that message in my hands before I answered. The way you brace a box you already know contains the thing you ordered a long time ago and half believed would never arrive. And I will not pretend I did not enjoy that pause, because after years of swallowing her comments and carrying her dishes and keeping the peace that only existed if I absorbed the hit, I had finally set something in motion that did not require me to announce myself as the author, and now the story was walking to my door on its own. I called him back, and he answered so fast it was clear he had been holding the phone, and his voice had that tight calm people use when they are trying not to sound like they grew up in a house that runs on appearances. And he said that there had been an uncomfortable conversation after the stewardship workshop because the coordinator followed up with a very polite note asking to clarify the year his mother had promised a camp scholarship and whether there had been any other outstanding pledges that needed reconciling before the end of spring. And he said the chair from the school fundraiser had separately reached out to confirm which tasks his mother had actually completed last year because they were implementing a new checklist to protect volunteers from burnout and to make sure credit matched work. And he told me his mother was furious in the particular way that has always made other people feel guilty for expecting basic adult behavior, and that she had told him none of this was a big deal and I was making something out of nothing. But when he asked her directly whether she had, in fact, paid the scholarship from Christmas, she could not bring herself to answer plainly. I let him talk because he needed to hear his own timeline out loud, and then I asked one question in the softest voice I could manage, which was whether the coordinator had shared the handout from the workshop that included the anonymous scenario about pledges being confused with payments and organizations printing things before receipts. And when he said yes, and that the language had made his mother feel attacked, I said that the handout was meant to protect the church from awkward situations and to help donors keep their records clean, and I did not add that the awkward situation had been manufactured by his mother for as long as I had been old enough to notice patterns, because he was already stepping on that realization by himself, and I did not need to push. Here is the part one have not told you yet, because it needed to arrive here to do its job. The neighbor who forwarded me my aunt's little brag about getting social credit for a pledge she never intended to pay also told me that the message had been sent to a small group chat that included 2 women from the stewardship team and a parent from the school fundraiser, which meant the words were not mine to expose. They were already out there, quietly, living their own life, and all I did was make sure the system they touched was sturdy enough that her words would matter, so when the coordinator asked for clarity and the chair asked for verification, they were not doing my bidding, they were doing the job they should have been allowed to do a long time ago. My cousin asked me what he should tell his mother, and every petty impulse I have ever had suggested lines I will not pretend did not make me smile, but I said something true instead. That if she wanted to protect her reputation, the fastest way was to pay what she promised and to stop asking for credit she had not earned. And he went quiet in the way that tells you a person is hearing the answer and hearing at the same time the list of times they ignored the problem before it hurt them. And when he asked whether I had sent anything to anyone, I told him that I had drafted a process note and I had, yes, advocated for transparency, and I had done so because I was tired of watching people work twice as hard to avoid saying a simple sentence. And he said he understood and that he wished I had told him sooner, and I said that if I had told him sooner he would have tried to smooth it over, and that was the one thing I could not let happen again. The next day moved like a train you can hear before you see. The bulletin went to print with the line thanking confirmed gifts by first name and listing outstanding pledges as awaiting receipt. The lobby poster stayed up with names in both columns and a plain envelope taped beside it with the word receipts written in careful letters, and the chair sent out the new checklist with her gentle note about aligning credit to verified work. And in the afternoon my mother called to report, with a kind of weary pride, that a payment had arrived for a camp scholarship from a donor whose last name matched ours, but whose first name was my cousin's and not his mother's, which told me he had decided to clean the spill without defending the person who knocked over the glass. And I thanked her for telling me and did not gloat, because the point was never to see my aunt hurt. The point was to stop letting her pile her image on top of everyone else's labor and make us smile while we held it up. Of course my aunt did not apologize. People who build their identity on being right do not say sorry, they reposition, and she tried, she truly did. because by evening there was a message in the family thread about how grateful she was that the family had come together to fund a camp slot, and how proud she was of my cousin for stepping in when her week became unexpectedly complicated. And there it was again. The little move where she stands under the applause even when she did not build the stage, and I stared at that sentence and felt the old tiredness creep up my spine. And then I did the last thing I had planned. The final move that looks like nothing and changes the room permanently. I replied to the thread with a short note thanking everyone who had contributed and a special thanks to those who confirmed their pledges on time so the bulletin could be accurate for Sunday. And then I attached a scan of the stewardship checklist and said I would be using it for the school fundraiser as well, so that next year credit and tasks would be aligned from the start. And after I hit send, I turned my phone face down and let the silence expand. You might think the victory needs a confession, a breakdown, or a scene at a dinner table, but the win was cleaner than that, because on Sunday the bulletin thanked the confirmed donors by first name, and the poster moved 3 names from awaiting receipt to confirmed. And my aunt stayed where it was until the coordinator, following policy, removed it entirely because the pledge had been fulfilled by someone else, and that is not how acknowledgements work, and the chair quietly reassigned public communications for the next fundraiser to a volunteer who actually returns emails. And in the family thread, my grandfather posted a line about how proud he was to see follow through modeled for the younger cousins, and my aunt, faced with the choice to either fight a process that made her look small or accept the new gravity, chose to post a picture of a pie and change the subject. Late that night, my cousin texted me again, not with a question, but with a sentence that made my chest hurt and also loosen in a way I did not expect. He wrote that he had always believed his mother's stories because believing them made their life easier and made him look successful by extension, and he said he knew I was not cruel even when I chose sharp tools, and that although he could not defend her, he could try to be better about what he attached his name to. And then he wrote the line that will probably sit in my head for a long time, that he did not know how to fix the part where his mother needed to be admired to like herself, but he knew he could stop acting like everyone else had to feed that need. And I told him that was enough for now and that I did not need an apology. I needed him to let the system work. So when you ask what happened after Easter, when you ask why she smiled at lunch and then went quiet in the weeks that followed, and why my cousin messaged me in the middle of the night asking me to call because she was upset and would not tell anyone why, here is the answer that does not fit neatly into a single frame. I did not out her. I outlasted the version of our family that made room for her stories by flattening everyone else's. I put a mirror where her stage used to be, and I watched her choose between paying her own invoice or living with the reflection. And while some questions will never get answered out loud, like whether she understands what she did or whether she will ever change, the part that matters is settled. Because I did not ask her to see me differently, I made it unnecessary for anyone to pretend, and that is the kind of win you do not clap for. You breathe, you sleep, and you wake up knowing you finally set the table for yourself.